Kenneth. Melanie, it is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Ted. Welcome, everyone, to this session of the Weatherhead Forum. The forum showcases the research and debates and scholarship of the various units and affiliates of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And today's session features our program on U.S.-Japan relations. The topic today is the political economy of global ownership and supply chains, quite a timely topic given the world that we're living in today. As Ted mentioned, I'm Melanie Kamet. I'm the director of the Weatherhead Center. I'm also a professor in the government department here at Harvard. And it's my great pleasure to briefly introduce both the program on U.S.-Japan relations and the chair of today's session. The program on U.S.-Japan relations was founded a number of decades ago in 1980 in response to Japan's rise as a leading global power. It seeks to advance knowledge of U.S.-Japan relations, contemporary Japan from interdisciplinary social science perspectives, global governance of trade, environment, and public health, economic statecraft and digital governance, and the international relations of the Asia-Pacific region. The program selects around 16 postdoctoral fellows, visiting scholars, and practitioners to spend a year in residence here at the Weatherhead Center to conduct research on such related areas. And it's my great pleasure to briefly introduce my wonderful colleague from the government department, Professor Christina Davis, who is the director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations and the chair for today's session. Christina is the Susan and Kenneth Wallach Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and Professor of Government at Harvard. She's the author of Food Fights Over Free Trade and Why Adjudicate Enforcing Trade Rules in the WTO, and also a number of other scholarly articles and publications. I very much look forward to hearing about the exciting research conducted in the program, and I'm going to turn the floor over now to Christina to introduce the topic and speakers. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really a wonderful opportunity for the program on U.S.-Japan relations to showcase some of our visiting academic associates and talk with the broader community. The program really has been having a great year, and this is thanks in large part due to the work of the executive director, Shin Fujihira, and our assistant, Emma Duncan, who work really hard to bring all of our visitors here to the program, as well as events like we have in our regular speaker series. Today, as part of the Weatherhead Forum, we're really happy to get to talk about one of the important topics that we're all thinking about. We hear so much about supply chain problems. Political leaders in the United States and Japan are devoting considerable time to try and come up with policies that are going to address the rising costs and shortages that have been frustrating consumers and harming companies and sectors, from automobiles to everything we all need in our daily lives. And today we're fortunate to bring to you new perspectives on these issues that are going to look at the role of national security interests, multinational firms that all interact with the politics of supply chains that help to get us all of the products we need in a global economy. So I'm going to introduce to you our theme, the political economy of global ownership and supply chains. We're going to hear from Professor Shuhei Kurizaki, who is an associate professor in the School of Political Science and Economics at Waseda University. He has been a leading scholar who applies game theoretic models to analyze the causes of war and peace, and he has joined us before when he was a Weatherhead Center at the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies back in 2005, 2006. He then went on to be an assistant professor at Texas A&M and then joined the faculty at Waseda, where he currently is a professor. Professor Kurizaki has done extensive work on signaling and conflict, published in the leading political science journals. He's currently working on a book about diplomacy. In his book on diplomacy, he's examining how diplomacy facilitates peaceful settlements for international disputes. I can't think of a more important topic to be doing research on. And today he will be speaking on national security, sustainability, and the politics of global shareholding network. We are also going to be joined by Kristin Vekasi, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Maine. Professor Vekasi's research interests include The Political Conflict Risk of Economic Exchange, Multinational Firms, Japan-China Relations, and the Indo-Pacific. Her book, Risk Management, Strategies of Japanese Companies in China, Political Crisis and Multinational Firms, was published in 2020 and is top on my recommended reading list to graduate students and friends alike. She's also written a fascinating article in the Japanese Journal of Political Science about the rare earth policy conflict that was a very big trade dispute between Japan, China, and the United States. Today, Professor Vekasi will be speaking about the politics of supply chain resiliency in the Indo-Pacific. Both are going to speak about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions from our audience. Thanks so very much. Without any further delay, let's open up to Shuhei if you want to get started.
Okay, here we go. Okay, how does it look? Is it okay?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, thank you, Christina, for a nice introduction. So I'm going to talk about something different from my ongoing book project. So this is on national security and sustainability and the politics of global shareholding network. Okay, so there is a great shift in the making in the way in which international politics will be played out. So the machine that is driving this shift is equity investments in corporate ownership. So this machine has grown so fast recently, and in one estimate, the asset under management in this global capital market has reached $100 trillion in 2021, whereas the US GDP was $23 trillion during the same time, right? So in the next 10 minutes or so, I will give you some insights into how the corporate ownership is organized around the world, how this network is shaping the geopolitical environment that would affect future international politics. So there is so much to talk about, so let's get into this, right? So how do we go about analyzing this machine with the data, right? So traditionally, the politics of international finance is being studied with the concept called FDI, foreign direct investment. The concept of FDI is okay, harmless, but its database is inadequate for our purpose because FDI does not consider a small amount of shareholding. Usually the cutoff is a 10% ownership in a target company. So let's use this sort of stylized model to see why FDI data is inadequate. So suppose that there's a shareholder A that has 1% ownership share in company B. Also suppose that in addition to this, shareholder A owns the majority share, say 51% in 6 other corporations in somewhere around the world, including paper companies, right? It turns out one of the, its subsidiaries or paper companies holds 9% share in company B, but this would not be a data point in FDI database since 9% is less than 10%, that's the threshold, right? So what if I told you that there was another subsidiary with 9% ownership also in company B, and yet another 9% and 4, 5, 6, right, of those, right, 9 times 6, 9% times 6 equals to 54%, and adding 1% to that, shareholder A becomes the controlling owner of company B, right? So unless we consider foreign portfolio investment or FBI that is below the 10% threshold, this type of the controlling shareholders can be hidden, right, in the data. So this is especially true now that the corporate ownership is increasingly fragmented due to the rise of passive investment in the index funds, right? So, therefore, the data we are going to use is called OBIS database, right? Published by the Bureau van Dijk. It contains information on 49 million corporations among 69 million shareholders in 2016. That includes publicly listed corporations and non-listed private companies, as well as government organizations and individuals like Warren Buffett, right? To analyze this massive data, we must use some sort of model and algorithm to guide our analysis. Otherwise, you will be lost in the data, right? So the model has to accomplish 2 things. for our purpose. One is to convert the size of ownership shares into a probability of established majority to control the managerial decision-making of corporations. The second is to take into account the network effect, that is a power to consolidate dispersed voting rights attached to fragmented ownership shares, right? So the first task is easy if you use the Shapley-Shubik power index in a weighted voting game from game theory, right? It gives the probability that the shareholder can be a decisive voter to form a winning coalition and dominate decision-making in some target company and become a pivotal voter. And to accomplish the second task, we have to extend this to a complex network, right? So there are exponential many ways to form a winning coalition to dominate in a company, primarily through consolidation and transitivity of ownership, right? So here's a simple stylized model shown on the slide. Our model is called NPI, Network Power Index, that essentially allows us to calculate the probability that each node in this model, right, can be a pivotal voter in every other node in this network, right? So this concept is actually mathematically involved. So I'm going to skip the technical details in the interest of time, and then let's look at the result of the analysis of the data. Here's the picture of the network controlling ownership among shareholders and companies. And for large enough shareholders, right? So that we have now, so I have to limit our focus to it for this presentation per se, because otherwise there's so many data points, and if we plot them, it's going to be just one big black dot, right? So therefore, this is a sort of sparse network. So what we end up is 43,000 shareholders and ownership networks among them. So pink dots are Chinese shareholders and green dots are American shareholders. You see there are a lot of both clustering and crisscrossing going on. So it's not, so the coupling of the market is not yet there, but it has some interesting implications for economic sanctions, right? Possibly against China in the future, I don't know. But I don't know if I have time to talk about that. But for now, the black dots are German shareholders, the orange are Japanese, the reds are France, and grays are others. Okay, so who are the big players in the picture, right? So let's begin with the bilateral sort of basis, ignoring the network effect, right? Which is similar to FDI, basically, right? As expected, number 1 and number 2 are BlackRock and Vanguard, as are often highlighted in the economic news, like this one on the right, right? So there are two, these are two of the big, big 3 asset managers that are supposedly dominate the world, right? But if we take into account the network effect, then the pictures are going to look different. So here's the sort of top 10 actors. As you can see, the Chinese government rises to number 1 with a huge margin, right? In terms of the size of power in our estimate, it is twice as large as that of BlackRock, that is ranked now in the 3rd. The second on the list is the SASC, so that's basically a state-owned asset supervision administration of the State Council. What it is essentially is the executive cabinet of the central government of China. So basically number 1, number 2 are both Chinese central government, right? So combining them together, they're collectively 4 times bigger than BlackRock. Okay. I also included the ratio on between NPF and PR on the 3rd column, but the PRs here stands for page rank, that measures the size of the ownership shares in the network. So you must be familiar with page rank because this is the core algorithm used in Google search engine, which basically captures the volume traffic in the network. NPF is our technical term for the probability that each shareholder might have a controlling influence over the target companies around throughout the network. So taking the ratio between PR, the page rank, and NPF allows us to measure how effectively each shareholder converts its equity shares into controlling influence. So if the ratio is less than 1, that means that this shareholder's investing strategy is less effective in this conversion. If the ratio is greater than 1, the shareholder is effective in converting money into influence, right? So this heat map indicates the density and distribution of this ratio for each shareholder, with PR on the x-axis and NPF on the y-axis. The ratio is 1 along the 45-degree line, so the ratio is greater than 1 above the line, 45-degree line, less than 1 below the line. So you can see that the vast majority of shareholders are located below the line, so their ratio is less than 1. When we look back at the table here, it is remarkable that only sovereign states have this ratio greater than 1, right? All the commercial entities have their this ratio less than 1, ranging around 0.8, 0.9. State Street has an exceptionally low score, right? This makes sense, right? When you purchase stocks, do you want to, do you do that to seek dominance in the target company? When you purchase a stock in Microsoft, for example, do you do it because you want to take over Microsoft? Probably not, right? So when you put your money in your pension fund or college fund for your kids, you do that for returns and dividends. And if you want to maximize your profit, then you must diversify your portfolio, and you should not concentrate in your investment in certain target companies. In other words, your ratio must be super low, right? So given this, it is interesting, so going back, it is interesting to see that the Norwegian government's ratio is par with other asset managers, right? Which suggests that the Norwegian government's investing policy is to maximize returns, while authoritarian governments like Chinese, Russian governments are incredibly effective in converting their equity assets into controlling ownership around the world, right? So, we have more data to explore the motivation behind the government's investing strategy, but I should move on, right? So let's go to this one, right? So what is this useful for, right? Why should we care about the global network of ownership shareholding, right? A simple answer is that so that you can follow your money. Here's one example of what would happen if you decide not to follow your money. So here's the case of the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan is the only central bank that purchases stock ETFs, right? That's exchange traded funds. And in response to economic downturn due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Bank of Japan decided to increase its purchase of ETFs. So we took the public information on the list of ETFs purchased by the Bank of Japan from Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Bank and connect that data to our data network, ownership network, right? And then, so in doing so, we focus on the companies whose shares are included in Bank of Japan's ETFs purchase, and then we also limit our analysis to the companies that Bank of Japan's indirect ownership through ETFs is more than 5% share in the target companies. So they're essentially 300 companies, and then we examine to see how many of those 300 companies are connected to companies that fail to meet ESG investing standards and the companies that are included in the sanction list maintained by the US government and Japanese government because they are deemed as contributing to the production of weapons of mass destruction or national security threats, right? So we use the shortest path algorithm of network to identify whether those investments actually reach malicious companies like that. So if the path length is infinity, that means that there's no link, right? So here's the result, which I think is shocking. About 120 companies whose stocks are included in Sumitomo Mitsui ETFs purchased by the Bank of Japan are connected to the companies included in the sanction list maintained by these two governments, meaning that these 120 companies are indirect owners of those sanction list companies, and the Bank of Japan is indirect investor of those 120 companies, which makes Bank of Japan basically ultimate owner of the companies deemed as malicious by the US Japanese governments. So some of the sanction listed companies can be reached actually within the network within 2 degrees of separation linkage distance in the network, right? Even worse, for ESG standards, about 240 out of 300 companies, that is basically 80% are indirectly investing in non-ESG companies. That's terrible, right? So by the way, it's not just Bank of Japan who have ETFs. You also must have some kind of investments, including pension funds. We summarized our calculation in this table, and pretty much every investment fund is related to malicious companies at some point in the network, and that probability is around 90%. It's small world effect, essentially, because every node is reached from every other node, right? So, but it's not exactly that, because there is about 10% without linkages, meaning that we can search for the path without linkages. Okay, so I only have like 30 seconds, and I had some interesting slides about the Tesla supply chains and security, but maybe I should stop here with just one 30 seconds concluding remark, okay? Here, so I was going to talk about the interesting case about Tesla, right? And so let me get, so ownership network is important, okay? But has been neglected in the field of international relations and political economy. If you want to analyze that, you should use our NPI model. But because it's not easy to analyze such massive data, we will make our country level data publicly available, which will be released this summer. So we are inviting scholars to play with our data before the release. So if you're interested participating in using the beta version of the data set, please email me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for a great presentation. I am sure many scholars and firm managers are all going to try and take your data, as well as the U.S. Department of Commerce. It sounds really important. Kristin, would you like to start?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for your introduction before into the Weatherhead Center for and US-Japan program for hosting me this year. And I also want to take this chance to thank Shinju Fujihira and Emma Duncan at the US-Japan program, who have just made this year really wonderful. So Shuhei just showed us how international security is everywhere in supply chains and investments. And this is something that we have all been seeing in the last month, looking at Russia, at the Ukraine crisis over the last 4 years, with the US-China trade war and more. So we see how international trade, investment, energy, technology are increasingly securitized. So what does it mean to securitize something? Well, it means that the results of these processes, trade, investment, technology, et cetera, can be considered as potential threats to national security by states. It also means that our foreign policy toolbox increasingly includes trade, investment, the development of technology, not just as maybe a carrot in cooperative relations or as a positive inducement to cooperation, but also as a coercive stick or as a coercive piece of economic statecraft. And lastly, it also means that trade, investment, the development of manufacturing processes, research and development and technology are increasingly considered fair game in domestic interventionism, no matter what sorts of international commitments might be made to free trade, or maybe were made in the past. So today I'm going to talk about the politics of how this process of securitization, what is sometimes called economic or supply chain resiliency, and sometimes called economic or supply chain security, works. My broader research compares Japan, China, and the US. Today, with this presentation with the US-Japan program, I'm largely going to focus on Japanese policy and response. But of course, I'm happy to take any questions on other cases. So we all know that supply chains are a very hot topic today. Many of the vulnerabilities and fragilities of our fragmented global production system were made very obvious by the pandemic to regular readers of the news. But although the pandemic revealed these things, discussions of economic security and vulnerabilities along the supply chain very much predate the pandemic, and in some cases are many, many decades old. This fragmentation and the way that the global production process happens are in a large part a product of globalization's success. This is actually a success story because of lowered transaction costs from, and in both business, economics, and also politics. So things like container shipping, cheaper communications, the Toyota production model of lean, just-in-time production that eliminates warehousing needs and gives us a slick supply chain. And then also political things like regional and global trade agreements that lower tariff and non-tariff barriers that make production more standard across different borders, that enable companies to have access to lower cost labor in places like Mexico, and then certainly, of course, in China. So all of these processes have facilitated extreme specialization, and they've also introduced points of vulnerability where manufacturing and production become very hyper concentrated in a country, perhaps in a region, or perhaps in some cases in a very specific company, right? Like, semiconductors being so many of that market share is like with just one company, TSMC. So what happens when a chain breaks, whether it is because of a natural disaster such as a flood or earthquake and tsunami, or perhaps because of a public health emergency, or increasingly, what if the chain breaks because of geopolitics, of economic statecraft, geoeconomic competition? So in my research, I look at these big questions of how will a securitized economy reshape globalized production? Which sectors, when this does happen, become securitized? And within this, what are the different roles of state and business actors, and how do they think about these processes differently? So thinking about this from a business perspective, a corporate approach thinks about perhaps supply chain resilience. That's the language I'll use. So thinking about resilience from a multinational corporation perspective, this is really the ability to respond to a crisis quickly and to get product to customers. And often this happens through diversification from a Japanese perspective, and now also increasingly from a US perspective. We think of this as like China +1, you stay in China, but also manufacture in other countries. This also happens through other methods of risk management, managing relationships with the government, managing relationships with your subsidiaries, making sure you're at the top of the list if a problem happens, so you're the company that's going to get things. Thinking about this from a state perspective, it's a really different concept of supply chain or economic security. So this is the ability to address national security concerns under points, again, of crisis. And now national security concerns could be very traditional things such as force readiness, right? Can we have the military equipment we need, or access to food? But it can also be more non-traditional things such as responding to a public health crisis, or even being technologically competitive. For example, under the Trump administration, the Department of Commerce said that economic security was national security, that in order to have strong national security, we needed to be technologically competitive. So some of the approaches that we might see to this are things like allied diversification, making sure that the supply chains are only with countries you might be comfortable with because of shared regime type or shared ideological perspective, and as well as things like protection of dual use technologies or critical infrastructure or other kinds of critical technologies. And I'll come back to. So in the US, China, and Japan, we see this happening in somewhat different, somewhat similar ways. So the United States, this is very much driven by competition and rivalry with China. It was brought to be very obvious in the pandemic era, supply chain security concerns initially with PPE, and then also with things like the supply chain for vaccine manufacturing. In China, much of this is driven by competition and rivalry with the United States, but it's also very much a story of domestic market development and economic growth strategy. And in Japan, some of the economic security issues have been adjustment to rivalry between the United States and China and the US-China trade war. But then there have also been responses similarly to the pandemic, but then also to previous economic coercion from China. So the way we see this play out in the three countries is also somewhat different. So in the United States, we see things like supply chain resiliency policies, for example, the America Competes Act, or some of President Biden's supply chain resiliency initiatives. There are new trade and investment restrictions. There's discussion of reshoring, manufacturing to the United States or ally shoring. In China, we have things like the dual circulation economy, developing products for the domestic economy, but while also exporting them at the same time. The Made in China 2025 initiative, moving towards domestic self-sufficiency in strategic and critical industries. And in Japan, we see this playing out with things like industrial policy for critical industries, and recently actual economic security legislation being introduced. So you'll notice here there's a lot of things like strategic and critical industries. What does that even mean? Let's get into that a little bit more. So in Japan, over the last few years, there's been much more discussion of this concept of economic security. And again, that was largely driven by the beginning of, or sparked by the beginning of the US-China trade war. For the last few years, the Japanese Ministry of Justice has been tracking notable trends in economic security, and this is some of the incidents that they see. Now, most of these are the United States. 70% of these are actions that are taken by the United States, 13% by China, 13% by Europe and the UK. And of these actions that are on here, like cybersecurity or formal sanctions or putting companies on the entity list, about 57% of those are against China. So most of this is US action that's taken against China, and that's what Japan is focusing on. See, some of these are fairly traditional security, things like cybersecurity and formal sanctions, but then others there are these newer things like really considering investment and supply chains, like direct supply chain support for firms, new investment restrictions and screening around the world, as well as focusing on specific firms on the entity list. So in 2021, the Japanese government, the new Prime Minister Kishida, made a ministerial level post on economic security, and then in 2022 introduced economic security legislation that somewhat comes from these trends that I've shown you. Now there's 4 different pillars here that I'll really focus on. Number 4, supply chain security. Others work to protect sensitive property, intellectual property, strengthen state support for certain sectors, protect the security of core industry, core infrastructure. But supply chain security focuses on supporting strategic industries, as well as introducing some industrial policy subsidies and investments. It is not entirely clear what is going to count as a strategic industry or a critical industry and what is going to be considered for this. And so I'm going to just walk very quickly through one sector of permanent magnets and the rare earths that go into permanent magnets. I've also developed another case on semiconductors, which I'm not going to talk about today in the interest of time. It's also been in the news more. You can read up on it yourself. So permanent magnets, we need these for example, electric vehicle and wind turbine motors, the transition away from fossil fuels towards green energy. We're going to need more permanent magnets, and we're going to need more rare earth metals to go into these. The best kind of permanent magnets come from neodymium praseodymium alloys, which are 2 of the 17 rare earth magnets. So as some of you may know, in the past, most rare earth mining happened in China. It used to be about 95%. When the rare earth sector was securitized, I'm not going to talk about the details here, but about a decade ago, companies around the world, Japanese especially, responded and started to diversify. And you can see that rare earth mining has now gone down to only about 60%. Some of that, that decrease though, doesn't show the extent to which that there still are perhaps vulnerabilities and fragilities in the supply chain. So you can see these are rare earth companies by sales. Most of them are concentrated in the United States and China. One of these companies right here is a new conglomerate in China. It's a state-owned enterprise called the China Rare Earth Group. And alone, it focuses on things like neodymium, praseodymium, and controls about 30 to 40% of total global production. In the midstream, so once you mine rare earths out of the ground, you then have to separate them into the different alloys and then purify them until they can go into something like a permanent magnet. So in the midstream processing, you can see that China also has a very commanding share. And a lot of this is also through that same group. So these data are tricky to collect, but so I'd say this is a modest 70% China controls of global rare earth processing. Now, I'll go back very briefly. So, sorry, there we go. So the increase here in rare earth mining around the world was a product of Japanese response to that. But in the midstream, and after they started to diversify mining, they also started to diversify in the midstream. So in particular, this Malaysian share, this is an Australian Japanese venture that was supported by the state. We also see significant US government support for this US part. And then also the Russian and Estonian midstream processing is not government supported, but is from a Canadian company. So we see then, so these midstream things then go into the permanent magnets, and here's the permanent magnet market around the world. So China here still controls about 70% of the permanent magnet sales around the world, but you can see that they are somewhat more diversified. There are also many more firms that produce permanent magnets than there are rare earth metals. We also see, so these arrows here are pointing to Japanese subsidiaries, and that Japanese companies do manufacture permanent magnets in China on a larger scale than they do in Japan, but they've also diversified to Southeast Asia, specifically to Southeast Asia. Now, they did this without state support, and indeed the permanent magnets that are necessary for these green technologies have not been securitized or been the subject of state support the same way that the upstream materials and then later the midstream processing has been. So here we see very strong Chinese ownership in all of these stages, and particularly at these early stages, the China Rare Earth Group has a very strong control. But lastly, in permanent magnets, there's really no dominant firm. The largest Chinese firm has about a 7% market share, a global market share. These two were subjects of securitization and then later state support, but permanent magnets, at least so far, has not been, even though if you were a policymaker that was very worried about Chinese control and that of Chinese dominance, that might be something you might look at. And so we have these different situations where the state and business might securitize a sector or not, and in these boxes. And in the rare earth mining and then later in rare earth midstream processing, we do see a move towards industrial policy, towards making this a subject of economic security. But in the permanent magnet, the next step down the chain, the state largely has ignored this step. This has not become a critical sector, and the business has just managed risk through China +1 diversification activities. Now, we do have some circumstances, for example, with semiconductors where the state has securitized and business has not, which I'm not going to talk about, but I'm of course happy to take questions on. And then pre-pandemic, personal protective equipment, while there were some policy papers out there, this was not a securitized sector prior to the actual crisis happening. And then the process happened later. So to end right here, and I'll stop screen sharing, when we do have sectors get securitized, there can be the creation of rival supply chains. And we see that to some extent happening with rare earths and with the midstream processing, but then not with permanent magnets, at least not yet. And we still have a production system that's deeply globalized, but we can have different chains that happen perhaps with China and then separated from China. However, when we do replicate these manufacturing process, that can lead to less efficient production, and it can perhaps hold back transitions to new technologies like electric vehicles or wind or other clean technologies. I think this risk is particularly significant in the green energy sector as well as other high-tech sectors. And as we think about security risks to supply chains, I just want to end to say that we shouldn't lose sight of our response to global climate change in the midst of geoeconomic rivalry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation on both the broader logic of the challenge of supply chains and this fascinating case of the rare earth and magnets. I'll launch with one question while everyone in the audience thinks of their questions that they can write in. I wanted to ask you both to think about where should the line be drawn for securitization of a supply chain? Because Shuhei's research has shown that Chinese government control and influence is quite wide. And one approach would be to worry that anything with influence by China is at risk. Another approach would more be identifying the commodity, like these permanent magnets that appear to be critical to a wide range of industries. And of course, the interaction of the two. But where do you stop? If permanent magnets are important, President Trump said steel was national security. And I just open your ideas on how you would come up with a prioritization.
Should I go ahead? Okay. Well, that's a tough question. I think it's well, first of all, something like national power grid, that's got to be securitized, right? Some basic infrastructure, or is something related to industry and production that has to be up to politics to decide. So I did get to show Tesla's supply chain networks and the political risks associated with each one of the dots in the network. I think that the Tesla is very vulnerable to country risk. So, but the question is whether, so if there's an economic sanction somehow in the future against China, then Tesla is going to be out of business. They can't produce a battery unless they come up with a radically different supply chain network. They have to redo that altogether, right? Unless they do that, then economic sanctions will devastate Tesla's production. So the question is whether the American government or the people in the United States want to protect Tesla's industry, production profit. I don't know if I had a clear answer, but that's.
So I absolutely agree that when we think about things like public goods and shared infrastructure, that's something where the state should play a role, and I agree with that. I think when Shuhei explains Tesla's potential security risk, that's Tesla's problem, and that Tesla should work on the variety of, they have a lot of resources available that they can diversify and try and mitigate that risk. But one of the broader risks where I see where we can generally think where the state might have a role in what should be securitized and what should not is looking at supply demand mismatch coming in the future, and the sorts of technologies that we will need to develop in order to have a thriving, prosperous, vibrant society. And so these things might be like building solar panels. And so if we are not able to keep up with that demand because of these particular supply chain choke points, that's a place where I think that supply chain security we should be intervening. And government should be intervening. And so and one of the problems with this is that we tend to, it's easier to look at the very upstream of the supply chain and say, okay, well, let's make sure that we have lithium. Let's make sure that we have neodymium and praseodymium. But that doesn't, but then after that stage, it gets much more complicated in trying to figure out, right, what precise materials you might need, how you might need to develop the expertise to process and purify those materials. And that's where you see, I think, a lot of these little puzzles. It's like, well, why not magnets? If you're worried about, first it was just mining and then it's processing to see that, but now, well, what about the next stage? And then with things like semiconductors, right? We've seen the semiconductor supply chain get politicized by Japan, in fact, in the last few years. And it was because of chemicals that I certainly did not know the name of before that trade dispute. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of policymakers that don't hold expertise in a particular sector. So so I think, I think there's a lot of technical expertise that's needed in this, and really unpacking, okay, we need to transition to green technologies. So let's try and back up down the supply chain and develop those particular things where we see market failure on the horizon.
Right. There's so many stages along the production supply, and if you miss one choke point, the other actors can be held up. So we do need more business managers as well as security conscious officials coming together to make these decisions. We have a question in the chat from Shen. Thank you for the great presentations. And Off talked about China-US decoupling in the next few years, decades. Might it take place more rapidly or extensively in ownership network than the manufacturing natural resource supply chains? I think you could both speak to that.
Can I pull up the my slide?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure about that. So if we look at this ownership share, China is, okay, well, China does both. So it's, China is not really, as long as we are, so given this data, China is not really being decoupled yet. Instead, China is pretty much everywhere, right? This is sort of, I don't know if this is sort of maybe confused a lot of people, but this figure for me makes a lot of sense. But this basically on the left bottom, excuse me, the left upper side, it sort of compares Chinese ownership network and the Russian government's ownership network. So Russians sort of the dominance in the market is really pretty much due to oligarchs, right? So a lot of influence only is concentrated on oligarchs in the case of Russia, whereas China is very dispersed. Their interest and investments and production so dispersed. So that means that the China is not really embedded in the global capital market, at least given this data, right? Compared to Russia, Russia is pretty much isolated, right? So I don't know, as long, so if you trust, this data, China is not really being decoupled, and I don't think it's really possible given what's, given the status, given the current status of the network structure. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I don't have that particular right now, and I think Shuhei's answer is probably gets a lot more to the technical response to this. But when we try and replicate manufacturing supply chains or production, or and certainly also natural resources, it takes for natural resource extraction, we have to accept that there'll be new environmental costs or figure out processes to do that in a more environmentally friendly way. That typically takes a very long time. It took over a decade for the United States to restart mining rare earths, for example. And for other processes that are very difficult, it also can take a decade or more to build the expertise. We know from the academic literature that portfolio investment can move much more quickly than foreign direct investment. And in particular, I think that's true for high-tech stuff that you can't just flip a switch and say, oh, now I'm really great at making photoresist at 99.999% purity. you need a lot of work to get there. So I do think that if we see decoupling happen, it would probably happen more quickly in ownership structure, but I'm agnostic on whether or not that will actually happen.
Great. We have a question from Aki Nakai, one of our CGP postdoctoral fellow. He thanks you for the wonderful presentation and comments about how all of us international relation teachers in the classroom discuss the commercial piece. And he would like to know, based on your research, do you think a commercial peace idea is losing power of persuasion over state leaders?
Yes, I do. I do think it is. I think that these, and in particular, because points of vulnerability have been so obvious over the last few years, to, their front page headlines that we have supply chain vulnerabilities and supply chain problems, and it's not something that is easy to hide to voters or to the selectorate in an authoritarian regime. That it is, I do think it's less persuasive to leaders, and that the vulnerabilities are easier to be weaponized. And that said, in cases between Japan and China, there are, I think, a lot of examples, recent examples, where economic interdependence has helped solve problems that would have become more intractable. So I do believe that the mechanisms of the commercial peace are still working, even as they are becoming perhaps less compelling to world leaders.
I would say it depends. I'll be careful when we talk about commercial peace. The type of disruptions, the type of hostile behavior that will be opportunity cost for trading. I think we need to be sort of separate between armed conflict, or general just security dilemma or economic sanctions. In terms of economic sanctions, I think current economic sanction against oligarchs of Russia, I think it's been successful only because Russian sort of ownership network, capital networks was pretty much isolated. But when China is in that place, I think it's going to devastate all the countries' economy. For example, like top 5 largest ports in Europe, every single one of them is owned by Chinese government, right? So if we want to sanction Chinese governments or its related subsidiaries, then we have to basically stop all the operations. The key point, choke point, Dipty, Valencia, Amsterdam, and Hamburg, they have to be stopped. So in that sense, opportunity cost will be enormous, right, for economic sanctions. So I guess, I guess it depends on what kind of disruptions we are talking about against, commercial peace.
Trying to judge the effectiveness of sanctions is always hard. The sanctions couldn't deter Russia from invading, but is this going to have impact with China in a way that would help reduce future conflicts? We hope. I have 2 questions I'm going to bundle and ask you to answer. One from Jim Vekasi asks you to think about intellectual property right, and can it also be seen as a type of limited supply, where if China were to develop the next revolutionary battery production process that makes all of the US electric vehicles obsolete, would there be any way for China to securitize that knowledge? And second question from Len Chopa asks, Shuhei, this is very interesting to see that Russia and China are converting their money into control more efficiently than Norway or private sector firms. I think you're implying that the control is being used to maximize the state's ability to use financial control to advance its security agenda. Is that the case with Russia? We hear that Putin and his oligarchs are using their control of energy firms to force them to waste a lot of money on unneeded services that enrich oligarchs but do little for state interests. Do you agree? And is the same thing going on with China?
I don't know if I have a good answer to the first one. What about you, Kristin?
Sure, I can take that first question. So thinking about intellectual property, this is certainly something that has been incorporated into economic security related legislation, both in Japan and the United States, and is long-term part of China's economic growth strategies as well. And so, for example, you can see specific funding of these sectors that are securitized within this legislation. So funding for research and development, opening of new research centers, funding students, that sort of thing. And so if you did see, right, a new, for example, production process, that particular knowledge, I mean, it certainly it would be an object of concern, and that I would expect to see a response, for example, in Japan, to try and play catch up really fast or develop some sort of alternative. That's what we've seen in other sectors.
Okay, I'll take the second one. Yeah, because that was for me, I guess. I would be careful in making inference about the motivations behind sovereign states investing strategies. It's so complicated, right? So on one hand, you put money in the market for dividends and returns, right? On the other hand, you might actually do that to control, some strategic assets, right? We don't yet have a clear evidence as to, so that we can make some clear argument. So we are not taking any positions on this. There are some people out there arguing that, some governments have very particular political intentions, but I haven't come up with the evidence. We are still, playing with the data. We haven't really seen any convincing evidence yet on that. So I'll be careful.
We have time for one more question, if anyone in the audience would like to ask. No? Then I would like to thank you all for sharing with us many of the complexities about how ownership control is spread out throughout the global economy, and also showing the potential how if you actually control an industry, but you use that influence, it only spurs others to diversify. And also, as the question came up, there may be questions about how efficient it is when states are trying to maximize the state interest and how much harm that is causing to the companies if they actually use their ownership share in ways that are not optimal for best business practices. And so thinking about the implications of securitization and state control over these industries, we do have to grapple with those trade-offs, because they are also important industries where you want open competition to come up with the best battery and production process to create the better products. And so if we see a complete decoupling or state guidance on firm strategies leading to a lowering level of innovation, that would be to the detriment overall and create a different kind of loss for the world economy. So these are really, as we think about the trade-offs of global supply chains, I think that we really do need an open public conversation about where we want to pay the higher cost of produce national control by the government versus the efficiencies of having a very elaborate global supply chain with efficiency by spread out production across countries and firms. So I'm glad we could have this conversation today, as it will help spur everyone to think about these issues in their research and conversations. And thank you so much to our speakers for sharing your research with us today, and for all the conversations we've been having over your year while you're here at Harvard. Thank you to the Weatherhead Center for letting us have this opportunity to speak with the Weatherhead Forum.